biotic interaction. In the biological environment, we identify both adverse and significant impacts on biological environment, prediction of significance of such impacts, and site-specific assessment of impacts, and provision of mitigation measures, preparation of environmental management plan, and different methods of monitoring of impacts needed to study the concept of the ecosystems and the different types of biodiversity and biogeological cycles and their fundamental duties in the environment, in biological environment, and carrying capacity of the biological environment is very important in the impact analysis of biological environment. In the biological environment, vegetation and wildlife impact analysis is the first one. In that, what is environment? It is the complex interaction of many factors, and change in one aspect of environment will affect the change. The complex interaction change of the any factor will affect the entire system in the environment. For example, vegetation and wildlife are the important features in the environment. The environment is biotic and abiotic. Abiotic is physical nature, energy, water, air, and topography, soil and minerals, and geological formation. These are all included in abiotic environment. In the biotic environment, living species, particularly flora and fauna, plants and animals, different plants and animals together complex in the environment. Flora, different flora are present in the environment. For example, trees, different types of trees, shrubs, and grasses, agricultural crops, variety of crops, microflora, and aquatic plants, especially survive in the water bodies, and enlarged species. These are all included in the floral type. And next one is the fauna. Birds and animals, fish in aquatic environment, shellfish, benthic organisms, and insects, different small insects, microfauna, and enlarged species, all are included. These will impact in the environment by establishing a proposed project. An ecosystem is a stable and interacting and gathering of living organisms. Plants and animals with a abiotic environment in their long non-living environment, which is unified by the circular flow of energy and nutrients. The ecosystem bound together by the biogeochemical cycles through which living organisms use energy from sun to obtain fixing of non-living elements. The fixing of non-living environment element is carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen from the environment, and that is transformed into vital food as a vital food to the plants and animals, including human beings. That we used and recycled in the nature. Next, the impact environment is direct and indirect impacts. The direct impact is those that destroy, displace, adversely affect the plants and animals. Any developmental activity that will adversely affect positive and negatively, that destroy the entire ecosystem surroundings, that harm to the biological environment. The indirect impact is those that destroy or disturb the natural habitat of the living organisms, particularly human beings and animals and aquatic animals, small insects. All these destruct habitat can impact the biological environment negatively. This is the indirect impact. The destruction of the habitat impact these animals, plants, and other living organisms in the surrounding environment or ecosystem. Those that destroy or disrupt the habitat, other physical and biological facts which a species depends on their nature of the activity, nature of the survival, nature of the habitat of the particular organisms. Next, living things everywhere interact with their non-living surroundings. In the environment, there are non-living factors are air, temperature, atmospheric pressure, water vapor, water, and soils. The soil consists rich in nutrients, which helps to grow the plants and living factors. Plants and animals. By the photosynthetic activity, plants produce the food as energy source. The food supply from the plants to animals and human beings. This is the living factor and total environment setting. It is suitable to humans. The next one is the biodiversity. The biodiversity, it is the essential processes that support the life on the earth, including humans. Life support on earth means plants and animals and human beings living in the habitat, in the nature. They include bacteria, different types of bacteria, protozoa, and fungi, different flowering plants, ants, beetles, and butterflies, variety of birds, variety of fishes, large mammals, large animals, animals such as elephants, whales, and bears, tigers. All these are important living beings in biodiversity. Without a wide range of animals, without wide range of plants and microorganisms, we cannot have healthy ecosystem that we really want to provide us with the air we breathe and food we eat. And people also value itself to the nature. The biodiversity, also known as biological diversity, it was first used by the scientist Rosen in 1985. In 1988, Edward Wilson provided the introduction of the biological diversity. According to the Wilson, the richness and variety of the living organisms in a particular habitat is called biological diversity or biodiversity. It represents the totality of the genes and species and ecosystems in the environment. It represents the species, genes, and ecosystem in a given region. The biodiversity and its maintenance are very important for sustaining our life on this earth. Different reasons are there for explaining the importance of biodiversity. Because maintenance of the biodiversity is important for sustaining life on the earth. There are few reasons explaining the importance of biodiversity. Ecological stability is the first one, and the economic importance and ethical importance. Economic importance means a biodiversity is a reservoir of resources the resources for the manufacturing of the foods, cosmetic products, pharmaceuticals, furniture, fuel, all this provided by the biodiversity. And the crops, livestock, fisheries, and forests are rich sources with food, rich sources of food. And wild plants, the plants which use it as medicinal plant purposes, we are using the wild plants in cancer treatments. And fodder value is very high with the wild plants. And food fibers and different perfumes, lubricants, resins, manufacturing resins from the plants, and poison manufacturing, rubber, all these materials, all these products derived from the different plant species in the biodiversity. The biodiversity improve the economic value by the national parks and sanctuaries that are the major sources of tourism, because they are the source of beauty. People enjoy the places in the tourism. And ethical values. Every life form have right to live on the earth. All species have right to exist on the earth. Plants, animals, including human beings. The human should cause their voluntarily, should not cause voluntary extinction of the species, that may be plants and animals. Because biodiversity preserves different cultures and the spiritual heritage. It is important to conserve the biodiversity as ethical importance. Because biodiversity describes the richness and variety of life on Earth. Biodiversity holds economic and ecological significance, and it provides nourishment, food, fuel, clothing, and several other resources. And it also attracts the tourism. So it is very important to have knowledge of biodiversity for sustainable living life. The biodiversity majorly three types: genetic biodiversity, species biodiversity, and the ecological biodiversity. The variation of genes, the species. For example, humans shows a lot of diversity among themselves. Humans are the best examples of the genetic diversity, and different, we can find different dogs in the society, different varieties of rice, different varieties of fruits, mangoes, and other fruits are the examples of genetic biodiversity. And next, species biodiversity. Variety of species, rice varieties, wheat varieties, maize, barley, many agricultural crops. The variation between the species And next one is the ecological biodiversity. The diversity in different ecosystems. Pond is the one example of ecosystem. Pond ecosystem, aquatic animals, fishes, and small insects we can find in aquatic ecosystem. In terrestrial ecosystem, we can find large animals and large plants, shrubs. Depending on their habitat, they survive in the particular ecosystem. Next one is the keystone species. The keystone species is a species with a dramatically large effect on ecosystem relative to its abundance. The keystone species impact the surrounding biological community adversely. For example, lion skills support bears emerging from small mountains, small mammals. What are the keystone species? The removal of keystone species from a habitat results in a dramatic changes in the habitat. It affects the other organisms, other species in the ecosystem that leads to get extinction. For example, bees and banyan tree. The bees pollinate the plants, helping their reproduction process. The plants provide shelter to the bees, which are then eaten by the birds. These are the keystone species. The banyan tree. Many birds survive on this tree. The birds pollinate the seeds from this tree. They are maintaining the sustainable environment. And biological concepts and terms. In the environment, different factors influence the organisms. Temperature, humidity, soil morphology, and water resources. All these factors influence the organism survival. Next, physical factors are non-living things, heat, drought, and soil, topography, and altitude. All these physical factors impact the biological environment in their survival. And biological factors, living forms. Living forms everywhere interact with their non-living surroundings. The nature of inanimate world largely determine which organisms live. The factors influence the living organisms adversely. The interaction of the living and non-living things from place to place change their interaction. Next one is the ecosystem. Ecosystem is the plants and animals, their interaction with the environment. Next, succession. The natural communities are not static but pass through a series of recognizable changes. It is the natural phenomena over a period of time. The community will change in another, change with the another community. When we observe the aquatic environment, the small grass shrubs dominate by the large trees. Over a period of time, the changes will happen. And assessing impact of biological environment. There are positive and negative impacts. The professional knowledge at plant and animal life, their habitat, requirement for survival, and they can ability to withstand and the disturbances they face in the survival. That negative impacts, possible negative impacts that might adversely affect the biota of the area. Biota means plants and animals, living forms that will adversely affect. The biotic habitat impacted with the developing activities. With each habitat, we will have the biological significance in the environment. The individual species impacted by interacting with the environment, they will have short-term and long-term biotic impacts and positive impacts on biological environment. The possible impacts that might occur a result of the project program, developmental activity, reduction and elimination of noxious plants and animal, reduce the fire hazards. And can wildlife management program results from the project? Can natural preserves be established, wildlife preserves and parks and sanctuary? By the developmental activities, increased the preservation of the rare species of plants and animals by establishing the parks, national parks, sanctuaries, etc. Assessing the biotic environment. Existing vegetation. In the vegetation, how much area occupied by the grasslands and type of forest existing, and the other vegetative characters in the biotic environment that we'll consider in the EIA. Regional setting for the site or action. Rare or enlarged species. Rare and endangered species. And plants with particular habitat. The individual species importance in the particular habitat will assess in the biotic environment. And wildlife, birds and mammals, fishes in aquatic animals, different insects, distribution of the wildlife, and preservation of plants, and distribution level, and with the proposal activity, disturbance level of the wildlife, plants and animals, and the plants can susceptible to project by the air pollution or not. All these factors will consider in assessing the biotic environment, and conceptual approaches for addressing the biological impacts. First one is the identification of biological impact of proposed project. In that habitat, every living form can survive in particular habitat. The changes will destroy or perish the species. Chemical cycles and toxic events. All these factors considered in conceptual approach, and quantitatively identify the potential impacts of proposed projects, the biological resources, habitats, and different species. And activities contribute to degradation of ecological values, degradation of biodiversity, that including in plants and animal species. And the ecosystem structure may disturb because the change the abundance of the species, composition of the species, with the developmental activity, species richness and the species diversity can decrease. And ecosystem functioning. In the ecosystem functioning, energy flow and nutrient cycle and water retention. These functions may change with the activity by the destruction of the biological impacts. And preparation of description of existing biological environment conditions considers enlarged threatened species, critical habitat flora and fauna. The flora and fauna which are in endangered, threatened, in existing biological environment. Consider in addressing the biological impacts. And next one is the floral pattern. Floral pattern is general vegetation pattern of the entire area, plant species, tree species in lowland forests, shrubs, rare plants. In particular habitat, surviving of the floral species in that area consider in the biological impacts. And faunal components of entire system. Different animals including amphibians, frogs, snakes, lizards, their habitat destruction, their survival will address in the biological impacts in proposed project report. Next, procurement of relevant laws, generation and criteria related impacts or condition, and impact prediction. Impact prediction is important in EIA. In EIA report, identifying incorporation of mitigating measures. Different impacts identification and mitigation measures to conserve the biological resources and the natural habitat of the area. Next, biodiversity is basic property of nature that provides enormous ecological and economic and aesthetic benefits. Next, guiding principle for green belt development. Selection of different plant species that should be fast growing, evergreen with thick cover and large leaf index, and resistance to specified pollutants. That is the important in green belt development. Selection of the plant species. The plant species should preferably indigenous to that ecological balance in that region could be preserved. The plants will preserve next guiding principles of green belt development. Trees growing up 10 meters or more should be placed in encircling rows around the installation along the roadsides or the developmental activity. Different shrubs, trees could also be defined based on the wind speed and stability conditions. And existing green belt, adequate green belt has already been developed in and around the existing plant premises, and locally available sufficient trees which are resistant to pollutants will be planted in the green belt development. The green belt development advantages are they control air pollution, trees remove carbon dioxide from the environment through the process of photosynthesis and release of oxygen. The way helps to remove pollutants from the air and improve the air quality. The green belts also trap the particulate matter and help in removal from the air. And noise control. A green belt works by controlling the noise waves, intensity of noise waves. The sound waves can be deflected, absorbed by the trees that ultimately reduce the noise intensity. The intensity reduction will depends on the green belt from the developmental activity, distance from the developmental activity. Because green belts destroy the sound waves, reduce the intensity of the sound waves, and also trees impacts humidity and climate with affect sound intensity. The green belts retains water and prevents water runoff that will reduce the erosion of the soils. The green belts helps in aesthetic environment for people walking, camping. If that is close to the cities or towns from the developmental activity. The green belt provide habitat for plants, animals, and wildlife, including human beings. And also green belts provides better land use pattern around the cities. And the green belt development should be started during the construction phase, which will continue the operation of the plant or any developmental activity. The locally available trees that can resist, that are resistant to pollutants, that will be planted. Apart from the green belt, extensive laws, extensive lawns, gardens, and approach roadside plantation will be carried out. Next, impacts of identification impacts. Quantitatively identify the impacts of the projects. Many projects loss of terrestrial environments by land conversion for industrial use and land conversion for agricultural use, residential purpose, and transportation. One of the biggest destruction of the environment with the transportation by destroying the ecological biodiversity. For the construction of the roads, we destroy the natural environment that disturb the natural habitat will impact the wild plants and animals. Next, timbering practices. The timbering practices for our survival, we use the timber for the furniture production and grazing different animals, livestock depend on the forest, and mining practices adversely affect the terrestrial environment, and water management practices also depend on the terrestrial environment. Military and recreational activities also loss of the terrestrial environment. These all impacts, quantitatively identified impacts, can cause the loss of the terrestrial environments adversely. The purpose of the greenbelt is protection of natural or semi-natural environments and improvement of quality of air, majorly in urban parts. Confirm that urban inhabitants have admittance to landscape with consequent informative and recreational opportunities, protection of rural societies that might otherwise be absorbed by expanding the cities. Designing of green belts. There are four important aspects in designing green belts: plant pollutant interactions, the wild plants can absorb the pollutants in the air, theoretical models for greenbelt developments, and selection of plants for greenbelt. The type of plants can grow in short term, and stabilization of fly ash with plants. The particulate matter absorbed by the tree leaves that can minimize the air pollution, and selection of plant species for green belt development. The species should be fast growing and providing optimal penetrability in the soil so that the, the trees can withstand in long time, and that can conserve from the soil erosion. As far as possible, the species should be indigenous and locally available because in that particular habitat they can survive, they can withstand in long term. And next, species tolerance to air pollutions like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide should be preferred. The minimizing plants air pollution will consider in greenbelt development and ability to withstand conditions like inundation and drought. In very drought conditions, in less precipitation habitat, they can survive. And soil improving plants by nitrogen fixing rapidly because they decompose the organic matter. Next, attractive appearance with good flowering and fruit bearing. The plants should have good flowering and fruit bearing character and attracting bird and insect species. And the green belt cover the green belt with minimal maintenance. The maintenance cost should be low. Next, the Central Pollution Control Board advised some tree species for the greenbelt development, especially. Some of the examples are Ajadirakta indica, neem plant, and Saraka Ashoka tree, Tarmingo indica, and Pseudium guava tree, and Hibiscus sinensis, Bohemwillia spectalis. These plants can developing in greenbelt area. They can withstand in long term and they can minimize the air pollution, noise pollution, and maintain the soil fertility by fixing nitrogen. These plants suggested by the CPCB. Next, the Biodiversity Act 2002. The Biodiversity Act 2002 is important in conserving the biological resources because healthy biological diversity is a fundamental right of the citizens. Under the Act 21, Article 21 of the Constitution of our India, the healthy biodiversity indicates the coexistence of the living organisms, all the living organisms in pollution-free environment. But this has been disrupted due to the introduction of urbanization and industrialization. The urbanization and industrialization been disturbed because shifting of population from rural to urban area. It leads to the overpopulation so that biodiversity came into the picture. The biodiversity implemented to address the issues related to the genetic resources, especially, and related knowledge. The other objectives also mentioned in the Biodiversity Act, using resources and associated knowledge by the country and its people. Some of the essential features of the Biological Diversity Act 2002 that are conserve and promotion of the sustainable usage of the biological diversity, the usage of the biological life forms, plants and animals in a sustainable manner. According to the Biological Act, mandate to setting up the biological management committees in state level, district, and up to village level. Biological biodiversity management committees. In central, we have National Biodiversity Authority to monitor the Biological Diversity Act implementation. In the state, we have State Biodiversity Board. State Biodiversity Board and National Biodiversity Authority are the monitoring agencies to the Biological Diversity Act 2002. These agencies, National Biodiversity Authority and State Biodiversity Board, can take the resolutions related to the Biodiversity Act, especially bio resources. The aim of the Biodiversity Act is respect and protect the indigenous plants and animals. Under the Biological Diversity Act, authorization is needed to obtain the biological resources and their associated knowledge. Next, Indian individuals and scientists are supporting transferring the research results. The Biodiversity Act protecting the resources, preserving the resources, plants and animals, and protection of the threatened species which are near to extinction. Under the Biodiversity Act, the suggestions given for the developmental projects, if the found by the state biodiversity board, they has the right to conflict if found encroach the preservation and sustainable use and profit sharing of the biological resources and guidelines provided by the Biodiversity Act to preserve and conserve the resources and the biodiversity management committees reporting is needed to the state government in discussion with the local body, Gram Panchayat, and the prior consent is needed from the biodiversity board and the biodiversity authority to use the resources. So the conservation of biological resources, managing its sustainable use, and enabling the source equitable sharing benefits, use and knowledge of biological resources with local communities. All these are monitored by the National Biodiversity Board. The biodiversity is important factor in the maintaining the EIA of biological environment. Different mitigation measures needed to implement when establish a project, avoiding, minimizing, rectifying, and reducing the natural impacts. The EIA possesses biological and vegetation wildlife. The environment are essential to have natural balance. Surveillance in natural ecosystem. The biological environment includes plants and animals majorly. Due to the project activities, several species of plants and animals can disrupt and destruct their habitat, and the communities will affect by the surrounding environment. Basically, EIA process biological environment consists different biological impacts, identification of biological impacts, environmental setting, procurement of environmental laws, impact prediction, and the mitigation measures to take the appropriate measures to conserve the resources in a sustainable manner. And the biological environment can be distributed by the land conservation, timbering practices, grazing practices, especially water management. Already we have discussed military and recreational also impact the biological environment because it required large area of conversion as land use pattern. In the impact assessment studies, existing biological environment of flora and fauna should be studied to know the endangered species of flora and fauna of the existing project and the laws relevant laws should implement to prevent the adverse impacts on the adverse effects on the flora and fauna, plants and animals. The possible impacts can lead to the habitat change, noise pollution will increase by the development activity. The especially breeding places will be disrupted by the habitat destruction and majorly loss of endangered species which are existing in the project area, proposal area. And professional judgment and knowledge have the most important significance. And the next one is the green development, green cover development, revegetation are the programs important to the protection and restoration of the environment. All these should be maintained to conserve the resources of the natural environment. The EIA process for the vegetation and the different wildlife environment, existing resources and impact analysis study, and loss of valuable vegetative species communities, especially wildlife and the different mitigation measures we need to take the appropriate action for the conservation. The impact analysis depend on possible alternatives and the degree of effectiveness. We consider the possible alternatives and loss of valuable vegetation, valuable wildlife, and their habitat must study to explore the restoration methods in the EIA process. The EIA process needed when the developmental activities as proposal For example, highways, railway lines, power lines, and large drainage channels, and the reservoirs, canals will affect the natural habitat adversely. That can minimize the wildlife activity. So, Biodiversity Act can conserve to monitor the biological resources by minimizing the measures, effects, and avoiding the activities that can impact the life forms, wildlife forms, rectifying the problem and compensation to the local people. To avoid all this, we should implement the Biodiversity Act, Biological Diversity Act effectively. All these are factors impact the environment, biological environment. The major distractions impact the wild plants and animals, flora and fauna. The impact analysis required for specific characteristics of the proposed project, proposed activity, developmental activity, and the expected degree of the effectiveness. For example, loss of the unique vegetation, and direct loss of the species. So, recreation is needed, and land use pattern distract the natural habitat. In the impact analysis, mainly loss of valuable vegetative community and loss of wildlife and habitat are the major studies. The analysis degree of impact of direct loss, vegetation loss, plants. The basic key efficient analysis is identification of the species, unique communities, natural communities, and next direct loss of wildlife and habitat. The project's developmental actions requiring land clearance and removal of the vegetative communities so National Biodiversity Authority, State Biodiversity Board should give clearance to removal of the natural vegetation before starting the developmental project, because larger species may emigrate to other areas and small species will most affected in the developmental area, and the carrying capacity for the particular species will minimize with the destruction of the habitats. The amount of habitat destroyed, proposed alternative should be identified, and another important thing is direct indirect impact and direct indirect impacts. Vegetation can provide secondary effects. Secondary effects on recreational sources, because vegetation is a major amenity of the natural setting. The larger natural resources, larger biodiversity support survival of the communities,